Introduction to Philosophy, Metaphysics and Epistemology, Reality and Knowledge. Metaphysics, as the term is used popularly, often refers to magic and types of mysticism, but that's not what we mean in philosophy when we discuss metaphysics. Metaphysics, according to E.J. Lowe, is concerned with the fundamental structure of reality as a whole, and epistemology is concerned with the nature of knowledge. These statements deserve some unpacking. For example, a reductive materialist or physicalist might claim that nothing exists in the universe that isn't physical, so metaphysics could be replaced with modern physics. However, since this is a claim about the fundamental structure of reality, it is a metaphysical argument, even if physics is thought to be all-encompassing. Epistemology will often focus on questions of how we know some topic of discussion, what knowledge itself is, and is it even possible to acquire. As we work through our text, Introduction to Philosophy Reader by Noah Levin, we will unpack the concepts further. The corresponding text for each lecture will always be linked below. Unit 1, Knowledge and Skepticism. 1. Introduction to Philosophy and Arguments. Our text begins by defining philosophy with the literal translation from the ancient Greek, love of wisdom, and lists some of the historically central concerns that persist to this day. These include diverse questions of knowledge, reality, values, reason, and the mind or soul. Pythagoras is also credited with the coining of philosophy, whom you may remember from other hits such as The Earth is Round, The Theory of Proportions, and of course the chart-topping Pythagorean theorem. Historically, philosophy could encompass any body of knowledge, but in a certain sense that is still the case. Indeed, any field of study, when taken to its most fundamental levels, will return to the realm of philosophy. This is why the highest awardable degree in most academic fields is the PhD, which stands for Doctor of Philosophy. The PhD basically is supposed to mean that you've advanced in your field to such a degree that you're now able to engage in your field at the philosophical level. This reminds me of a startling event I experienced at university. I was studying philosophy and cognitive science at UCSD, and I attended a school function at which recent graduates were invited to speak. One speaker that caught my attention because he said he switched majors from philosophy to cognitive science, and I was studying both at the time. When asked why he changed majors, his answer was, "I didn't like that you don't get answers in philosophy, but you do get answers in cognitive science." I was taken aback by this because how could it be that a student who just graduated from such an academically rigorous school not realize that the fundamental questions of philosophy don't just disappear when you change majors, you simply ignore them. According to our text, the sciences as we enjoy them today developed out of natural philosophy. Philosophers would refine their methods, limit the scope of their investigations, and develop unique ways of getting their target results and acquiring knowledge. For example, this is similar to how psychology emerged from philosophy. Philosophers in 16th century Germany had altered their methods of investigation, narrowed their scope to the mind to such a degree that they determined their particular methods of investigation warranted recognition as a standalone science. Setting aside fundamental issues and big questions for philosophers in order to make specific types of progress in new sciences is a practice common to most branches of science. Consider how little would have been accomplished by physicists, biologists, and medical researchers if they refused to examine simpler problems until they had resolved such big and fundamental issues as the problem of induction. Indeed, they probably if they hadn't pushed those fundamental issues and difficulties aside for the sake of discipline-specific progress, we might not have had the moon landing or the crack of the human genetic genome or the discovery of penicillin. In philosophy, questions big or small cannot be left unanalyzed. This is one of the points of philosophy. Like in weight training, lifting heavier objects repeatedly makes lifting lighter objects much easier. So too does dealing with big questions repeatedly make dealing with smaller questions much easier. Even though changing majors from philosophy to cognitive science temporarily avoids big fundamental questions, it does not escape them. It merely takes problematic presuppositions for granted for the sake of making field specific progress. Another sense in which it is still true that philosophy can encompass any body of knowledge is that you can philosophize about anything. You can take courses in philosophy of religion, science, psychology, and so on. However, the sense that our text means is the process I just described, that is, over time, philosophers adjusting their particular theoretical approaches until they warrant recognition as standalone sciences. Some of the examples our text gives are the developments of physics, medicine, biology, zoology, and astronomy out of natural philosophy, and the development of computer science out of logic. The project of refining existing sciences and developing new ones is one of the central practices of philosophy, at least it has been historically. Philosophy is not just sitting in an armchair thinking about thinking. Our text has a very succinct segue from philosophy in general to philosophy in the Western tradition. As our text says, in one general sense, philosophy is associated with wisdom, intellectual culture, and the search for knowledge. In that sense, all cultures and literate societies ask philosophical questions such as how are we to live and what is the nature of reality. A broad and impartial conception of philosophy, then, finds a reasoned inquiry into such matters as reality, morality, and life in all world civilizations. However, Western philosophy has become much more sophisticated. The approach of appealing to Homeric myths to inform ethical questions, as was common in the ancient Greco Roman era, and the hand waviness of appealing to immaterial souls and scriptures of the medieval and early modern eras no longer fly in Western philosophy as we know it today. While there may be some wiggle room for such things in other philosophical traditions, there is none in analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is characterized by intense argumentative rigor and clarity, with emphasis on logic, mathematics, and the sciences. Contemporary analytic philosophy has its origins in the Socratic or perhaps pre Socratic philosophy. Socrates is the historical paradigm of Western philosophy. Socrates professed to know nothing other than this, that he knew nothing. In a sense, what Socrates was saying might be that at the time there was no adequate method for arriving at what he would consider real knowledge, though he did employ a method that would inform our current methods of teaching and investigation to this very day. The elenchus was Socrates' way of eliciting truth from his interlocutors through a process of question and answer and refuting their claims by elucidating inconsistencies in their immediate claims, common thought, and ancient Greek religion. Some claim that the Socratic tradition, inherited by Plato and Aristotle, was characterized by a break from theistic thought. However, it may also be the case that the Socratics were monotheistic. It's hard to say who is right, since in either case, Plato and Aristotle would not have been able to publish such positions explicitly, lest they suffer the same fate as Socrates. Indeed, the punishment back then for challenging the established gods of the state was apparently death. What is important for this conversation is that the leaders in Western thought were moving away from the established organized religion. However, this trend would cease for a time. During the medieval period, ancient Greek texts and philosophy would be repurposed by theologians and applied to religious texts in order to form a consistent system of morality, science, and religion. This religiously inspired philosophical movement, scholasticism, was vast and eclectic. Notable philosophers from this time include St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, all of whom we'll discuss in later lectures. This portion of our text concludes with a brief introduction to early modern philosophy. René Descartes is often described as the father of modern philosophy. This era was characterized by an effort to develop philosophy in light of secular scientific advancements. Some of the philosophers highlighted by our text include Spinoza, whose views on God influenced Albert Einstein, Leibniz, who seemed to develop calculus at the same time as Isaac Newton, Locke, whose work on human understanding influenced his successors immensely, Berkeley, whose dialogues still challenge people, Hume, who somehow body slammed almost all of philosophy by the age of 26, and Immanuel Kant, who, despite being almost completely unreadable, had a profound impact on the entire landscape of philosophy. The Enlightenment followed in the 19th century, and Hegel, who was as unreadable as Kant, somehow greatly influenced German idealism. Nietzsche is merely framed in our text as an anti Christian, but there was a lot more to Nietzsche than that. Nietzsche was a philologist, someone who studies classics, but identified as a psychologist, who wrote what was essentially poetry, and but mostly is taught in philosophy classes. Indeed, Nietzsche was a unique individual and thinker. John Stuart Mill famously updated utilitarianism from Bentham's hedonic version in this time period, and Karl Marx is credited with developing the foundations of communism. Though Marx also had interesting ideas about dialectical materialism that aren't mentioned in our text. The American pragmatist William James is also rightly highlighted in our text in this era, as his ideas would have a substantial impact on many areas in philosophy. Finally, our text says, in the 20th century, we saw a split between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, as well as philosophical trends such as phenomenology, existentialism, logical positivism, pragmatism, and the linguistic turn. 2. Introduction to Arguments. For the purposes of this course, logic is the science that evaluates arguments. An argument is not an emotionally charged fight, as some people may conceive of them, but a conclusion supported by premises. Premises and conclusions are statements that must be either true or false, but not both. In logic, a statement is both true and false, that is both true and false, is a contradiction, and a contradiction is defined in logic as a statement that is never true. In philosophy, we're not concerned with appearing correct as in debate, we're concerned with truth. Therefore, the winner of a debate is the one that appears right at the end. However, the winner of an argument is the one who walks away having learned something. Arguments so conceived can be formal or informal. Formal arguments are expressed in symbolic logic. Symbolic logic uses meta-variables in place of semantic premises and conclusions. Informal logic is a practice of applying logical rules to arguments advanced in ordinary language. There are several types of arguments, but deductive and inductive arguments will be our focus. In deductive arguments, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In other words, a deductive argument is one such that, given the premises are true, it is impossible that the conclusion is false. Indeed, this is the best we can hope for with any of our arguments or beliefs. Unfortunately, most of our arguments and beliefs are inductive, so we have no guarantee with regard to the truth of our conclusions. An inductive argument is one such that, given the premises are true, it is unlikely that the conclusion is false. Therefore, the premises of a deductive argument guarantees the truth of the conclusions, while the premises of an inductive argument only support the conclusion's probable truth. Again, when logic is studied in isolation of semantics, it is called symbolic logic and only gives you the validity of those arguments. When studying logic symbolically, it is often difficult for students to recognize how symbolic logic hooks back up to argumentation in natural language. This is because symbolic logic focuses on the mental mechanics of implication and inference. For example, if premise 1 of an argument is A is equal to B, and premise 2 is B is equal to C, then the conclusion A is equal to C will follow with logical necessity. In deductive arguments, the best you can hope for is a sound argument, What this means is your argument is one of proper logical form, making it valid, and the premises are all true, making it sound. Therefore, you can derive a formula: validity plus true premises equals soundness. Validity is a specialized term in deductive logical contexts, quite different from how we use the term in everyday discourse. For example, our text considers an argument with a true premise, bats can fly, and a false premise, all flying animals are birds, and the conclusion that bats are therefore birds. In the ordinary use, it wouldn't make any sense to call this a valid argument, but in logic, validity is a question of the form and not the final judgment of the overall merits of the argument. Though this argument is valid, that is, the conclusion follows necessarily given the logical form of the argument, it is not sound, because the premises are not all true. However, most of our arguments are inductive, meaning the best you can hope for is cogency. When an inductive argument is of a proper logical form, it is strong, but when it is of a proper logical form and all of its premises are true, it is cogent. Therefore, we can derive the formula strength plus true premises equals cogency. Our text provides the example: given that the US military budget is the largest in the world, then it is probable that it will remain so for the next 10 years. Arguments predicting the future are inductive because the future is uncertain. But if we look at this short argument, we can say that the single premise does give us reason to suppose that the conclusion follows, so it is strong. And we also know that the premise is true and the conclusion is true to the best of our knowledge, so this argument is cogent. Our text goes on to discuss different types of arguments and mentions fallacious reasoning, but doesn't provide many examples of fallacies. Fallacies are errors in reasoning that are so common that they've been given names. Some common fallacies that we should watch out for in our own arguments include bandwagoning, begging the question, straw man, poisoning the well, and equivocation. There are many others, but being mindful of these fallacies will help to avoid fallacious reasoning in general. Bandwagoning, also known as argumentum ad populum and appeal to popularity, involves claiming that a conclusion is true because many people believe it. I had a roommate once who said she wasn't going to read 50 Shades of Grey, but changed her mind when she found out that it sold over 1 million copies. She said, "1 million people can't be wrong, so I bought the book." However, we can see that this is fallacious since, even though everyone once believed that the earth was flat, those beliefs had no bearing on the fact that the earth was actually round. Begging the question, also known as circular reasoning, occurs when an argument's premise assumes the truth of its conclusion instead of supporting it. For example, if someone argued that black was the worst color because it is the blackest of colors, is a circular argument. It doesn't support that black is the worst color, it merely assumes it to be true. Another common example used for begging the question is, "I know the Bible is true because it contains the Word of God, and I know the Word of God is true because it says so in the Bible." The straw man fallacy occurs when someone gives the impression that they have overcome an argument, but in actuality only refuted a weaker argument that somewhat resembles it. For example, if Jack argues that marijuana should be legal for adults to use recreationally, and Jill argues that any society with unrestricted access to illegal drugs will collapse, is a straw man argument, because Jack's argument was stronger than the one refuted by Jill. Poisoning the well occurs when someone undermines another's argument with preemptive adverse information about them. For example, Jill may say, "Before you listen to Jack's argument, I'll have you know he is a communist with radical ideals." However, even though if that information were true, it would not actually make his conclusion false. Equivocation occurs when a word or expression is inexplicitly used in multiple senses in the same argument. For example, consider this short argument. Jack says that the end, in the sense of a goal, of human life is the good, but the end, in the sense of termination, of human life is also death. Therefore, human death is the greatest good. This unacknowledged shift in meaning of the term end merely changes the topic and has no bearing on Jack's original argument. What fallacies in general have in common with each other is that they are intended to show that a certain conclusion doesn't follow from its premises, but it doesn't actually follow from fallacies that a certain conclusion isn't true. Keep these fallacies in mind when you respond to the arguments and questions in our text, so that you do not fall victim to these common errors in reasoning.